Welcome back to O.R.B.I.T.S Consulting. My name is Manal Zainuddin, Global Education Consultant and founder of O.R.B.I.T.S Development Code, an approach for conscious learning and being. This podcast highlights education communities from macro and micro angles, leadership, learning, personal and professional growth across multiple disciplines. Education is holistic and as vast and infinite as the cosmos. As we bring stories, interviews, talks, projects from around this globe, I extend Plutarch's famous quote that I had posted in the schools I have worked in. The mind is not a vessel to be filled, but a fire to be kindled. On this guest episode, I wanted to bring up one of the most important themes needed during these challenging times of COVID-19, which relates to mental health. And one of the very effective tools for verbalizing emotions is Emotional Intelligence Mapping, EIM, created by Garner, our guest today. Garner is the Director of Psychology and Education at H2 Advisory for Leadership and School Development. He is the creator of the Emotional Intelligence Mapping concept and a number of other psychological models used in modern leadership. He has over 20 years in developing human capital and has personally mentored senior executives from around the world. Through his Emotional Intelligence Mapping, EIM, Garner provides consulting and support for schools and universities pertaining to leadership, assessment, school culture, and learning, accelerated learning programs and development and training. He is currently working on multiple projects in the region, incorporating emotional intelligence tools in educational institutions. Carl, it is such a pleasure to welcome you on this podcast today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. What drew my attention to your model, Emotional Intelligence Mapping, EIM, is the way you specify emotions because, as you know, people tend to speak about emotions, but at a tangible level, they fail to recognize them accurately. This leads to confusions, misinterpretations of oneself and others, and eventually conflicts. So today we will be talking mainly about Emotional Intelligence Mapping, EIM, as communities all around the world, especially education, have been tragically impacted by COVID. We will also explore learning powers, a staged character development curriculum, also based on emotional intelligence. So starting with Emotional Intelligence Mapping, EIM, the model can be found on H2 Advisory website, www.h2advisory.co.uk. I invite our listeners to check that later. But for now, to make it easier to visualize, I can describe it as a London tube map, but a simple one for emotions. It has the following lines: happiness line, empathy line, anger line, relevance line, trust line, and stress lines in relation to self and others. Actually, I found this very helpful as it names feelings in a smart, visual manner. For example, on the happiness line, you have a guilt branch and a loneliness branch, and you have the terms embarrassed, guilty, shamed, disgraced. Of loneliness, you have on the loneliness branch, you have lost, neglected, rejected, and you have on the other side high energy and low energy as well of the happiness line, such as elated, excited, euphoric, or serene, affection, and content. So I find this really very interesting. What can you tell us about the idea of such a design? I mean, the resemblance between emotions and their connections to the tube map.
It's an interesting question, actually. It began with looking at Dr. Robert Plutchik's work. He used to do a wheel of emotions. And in cognitive behavioral therapy, people sort of struggled with this little linear, symmetrical approach. And one of the things that one of the cognitive behavioral therapists resonated with me when they said, our emotions are so complicated, we just need to simplify it. And then I remembered a guy called Harry Beck. Harry Beck was a cartographer. And this cartographer was the guy that created the London Underground mapping concept that is now seen all over the world. What he basically did, and one of the phrases he used, was how to simplify the convoluted. And he said to get from A to Z in London was very complicated, and he wanted to simplify the metro system. And that's why he came up with this particular mapping method. And I chose to use the same mapping method in emotions for cognitive behavioral therapists.
Wow, that's amazing, actually. It's important to understand the situations at the core and solve problems at grassroots level. And the model, when connecting it to psychology as a science, makes the process of qualifying emotions more research-based. And we all know that being unable to handle certain emotions may lead to mental health issues. Now, mental health is a very broad theme and involves more than one factor, and maybe we can have another episode about that. But let us today consider certain feelings that were intensified by COVID. I think the two most prevailing ones during the pandemic are stress and anger. How is stress addressed through emotional intelligence mapping?
So stress is when we basically, if we can understand how we're feeling at any given moment. What seems to happen in these particular times, we have this what's a psychological phenomenon called mass hysteria, where there's so much media going on right now that people are starting to go into this panic mode, and their cortisol levels are increasing. It means that their emotional cup is much more full than what it usually would be. It means like the sympathetic nervous system starts to take over. So you start to feel uncomfortable, then you go to concerned, you feel vulnerable, then overwhelmed. The sympathetic nervous system takes over, and you have this fight, flight, flock, or freeze symptoms. And this is when we start to, our body takes over, and we might not be making rational decisions. And it's important when we have a look at the mapping tool, is if we can recognize how we're feeling at any given moment, it makes us more in control of those particular moments. So for example, we use this as a proactive tool, not just in cognitive behavioral therapy, but a proactive tool which anybody can use, the layperson can use. If they can recognize, for example, before they jump into their car, and they recognize how they're feeling, and if they're already, let's say, feeling vulnerable or overwhelmed, the chances are that somebody could do something like indicate and move into their lane, and it could cause a fight, flight, flock, or freeze response, and therefore they might be making a poor decision whilst in a well, theoretically it's a lethal weapon, isn't it, a vehicle.
Right.
So that's one way of looking at it there with the stress line.
That's so true, actually. Yes, and we are handling stress quite in a very confusing way with whatever is happening nowadays. Now, obviously, emotional intelligence has a variety of benefits, and by this I mean personal and social competencies for this new decade and beyond, such as self-awareness, communication, social influence, empathy, and much more. But I would like to highlight wise decision making. In this world of uncertainty and complexity, it's critical to make wise decisions. And here we are speaking about also decisions worldwide. So wise decisions can either save lives or endanger lives. And we have seen that during tests and trials of world organizations and systems as they struggled with COVID's hazards in health, education, and economy. So how does having a high EQ help make more impactful decisions?
Having a high EQ, basically every decision we make, even the most logical of decisions, is based on our emotions. It only makes sense that we should be enhancing our emotional literacy. If we have a look at the anger line, for example, how often do we verbalize, oh, I was furious, I was raging, and if you think quite carefully about the situation, very often it will stem back to us. If we were to re-qualify more accurately, it would be something like, well, actually, I'm probably a little bit agitated, or I was probably just frustrated. In fact, if you experience any intensity of emotion on the anger line, if you simply take away that building block of confusion, it sort of breaks down. If you can imagine, if you will, a temperature gauge, and if it's in a building and the building was on fire, the building doesn't jump between 80 degrees Celsius to 200 degrees Celsius. At any given moment, if we pause time, we could accurately define how high the intensity of the heat is for the building. We do have, of course, the doors opening up and a backdraft coming in, the temperature would raise quickly. But still, at any given moment, we could accurately qualify the temperature of the building. This is the same thing for our anger. So people say, oh, people are very quick to lose their temper. What I hypothesize is that we have a number of emotions that haven't been processed. So if we can accurately process those emotions more effectively, or even accurately identify those particular emotions, we become better decision makers. There's some research done at Yale University which looked at memory tests, and this was a fascinating study where you would go in, different groups of people would go in and they would watch a video. Number 7 on one of the questions said, when the cars collided, did you see glass on the road? And of course many people said no. The second group said, when the cars smashed together, did you see glass on the road? And many people said yes. I think there's about a 1 in 3. 3 times as many people said they saw glass. So now we know that our language, the linguistics, can actually affect our memories. And if you think about how often do we exaggerate our terms, oh, I feel so depressed, or, I was furious, or the sort of malicious, scornful language that we use, it can actually affect our memories of how those incidents actually occurred. People often look at anxiety as finite. So many things in psychology, they look at it as binary, 1 or 0. So it's like forgiveness. Do you forgive somebody? Yes or no. Are you stressed? I'm stressed. Or you're not stressed. Are you engaged or not engaged? Are you happy or sad? And they go to excited to depressed. But if you look at it, if you are feeling any negative feelings on the unhappiness line, for example, so you're dissatisfied, unhappy, insecure, sad, if you simply stop and work at, you don't have to have affection and elation, you can just jump to optimism. You simply have to go to optimism. If you're feeling any negative feelings on the trust line, for example, where you're suspicious or doubtful of an action or a person, simply go to hope. You don't have to have belief and certainty to them. You just have to go to the beginning intensity. So it's just about changing the direction you want to face.
Can you tell us please more about the relevance line and the guilt line, because these sound very interesting?
Okay, well I'll start off with the relevance line because it's being used currently. We're developing an app for this for schools, and we want to be able to place this into schools. So an intensity model would be used to, schools with the kids or the students would turn around and they would say how they were feeling. And it was really interesting because we were able to do this in our test models where a teacher would have these tablets placed out and they would ascertain how intense they were feeling at different times. But imagine this as a teacher, that you would have this data that would come back to you in the reports, which would suggest that the kids were distracted or bored or frustrated. Immediately, you would do something about that the very next lesson. But if you didn't, then the data also goes back to the headmasters. And if they turned around and I said, oh, Miss Manal, I'd like to have a conversation with you because did you realize over the last 4 weeks that 78% of your students were either distracted, bored, or frustrated? Clearly, we need to have some conversation, but it sort of nullifies the effect of having these buzz observations in classes. But now the teacher is culpable for how engaged these students are. And then if you're, as a student, if you're having a look at it and you find yourself in different classes feeling distracted or bored, there are techniques that tell you that if we simply engage in curiosity, this is the way to get engaged, enthusiastic, and interested children. So we literally have to start the very first building block. The reason why I think it's going to be quite good to have an app like this. Only recently they were talking about arming teachers, giving teachers guns in classrooms as a way of combating these mass killings in schools. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, I don't believe that anybody is an engaged, curious, confident, warm-hearted, sentimental student, then turns around the following day, picks up a weapon, goes into a school, and starts a mass shooting. I think that they are distracted. Then they go to bored, frustrated. They may go to lost. And they get to lost, they get them to be neglected, rejected, demoralized. It takes a while for these children to get into this dissatisfied state. And therefore, I think if we were to map this out, and if all schools had these sort of apps where they were developing this, then we would have a much better education system.
Well, I fully agree with you, because this will evade lots of conflicts, especially with adolescents.
Yeah, what was really good is we were able, that teachers were able to get a small amount of cognitive behavioral therapy. So when we did this with our teachers in South Africa, a very simple technique, for example, they talked about people feeling embarrassed or guilty or shame or disgrace. And then we used a simple technique which said any emotion on the guilt branch is from a fundamental belief that that person could have done better. And if we recognize that, we can start to think, well, what can I do about it? So instead of looking at an incident and saying that they are feeling these negative emotions on the guilt branch, they can now look at those experiences as what have they learned from it? What could they do better? And that's, like I said, that fundamental reason that they could have done better is the reason for any emotion on the guilt branch. So when we did this, the teachers were now able to almost become mini psychologists by going out there and using the map and some of the techniques that we use to actually support the holistic mental health of the individual students.
Yes, that's fascinating, because you are not only helping the learners understand themselves, you are also helping teachers understand their learners and see how they can at least do some preventive measures for any incidents that might happen. This is amazing.
It was one of the pieces of feedback that was the most prominent was the fact that, and we've done this now in multiple schools in different countries, but one of the best feedback that we get, and there's a commonality with it, that is that the teachers have started to feel as if they've developed. So beforehand they saw it as a training that they had to do, and now they're seeing it as a training that they want to do.
Oh wow, this is really amazing, because you need readiness, and we have spoken about this earlier. Sometimes you feel that I don't have the answers for this problem. Now they feel that they already own those solutions and those answers. And I think you are just speaking also about those, two opposing aspects for using this tool. Like the first one is having to trust oneself, and because many people find it more reliable to ask others and trust the opinions of others. And the second is setting our pride aside as we try to interpret the wrong actions of certain people around us. And I think you have just spoken about that. I don't know if you can elaborate more on this.
Yes. So, for example, I give an interview before, and I talked about how if there was a vehicle that was cutting you up in traffic, how would you feel? And very often ego gets in the way. But if we try and take away the building block of confusion, some people would say, but I don't know, even if I ask the why question, I can't physically, shout as to say to the driver, why has he acted this way? And this is why that it's really important to make excuses. So what I tend to do is, if somebody's done something or wrong to me when I've been driving, I tend to have the excuse mechanism will kick in. And the excuse mechanism kicks in, or say something along the lines of, like, maybe he's a young man and he is about to go to the hospital, he's just about to have his first child. And therefore, the reason why I make the excuses for him, it doesn't, we're not saying the behavior that he's done is acceptable, but I just make a choice that I choose not to elevate my anger. So I do it because I deserve it, not because that person deserves it.
This is absolutely amazing, and this could save people from so many problems and conflicts in their daily lives, actually. Yes, Carl, we all reiterate that what we cannot be measured cannot be analyzed. Now, you measure emotional intelligence with a specific tool, and this is very interesting, the psychometrics assessment. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, the psychometrics assessments are designed so we are able to assess levels of their emotions, assess the intensities of the emotions. So there's different research going on in the United States currently with Dr. Darren Aitchen. There's also some research that's going on in the UK and also here in Saudi Arabia. And what they're trying to do is to find an intensity of emotions so we can accurately qualify how we're feeling.
That's very good, actually, because people cannot, when they cannot measure it, then they cannot find it credible, and through these researches I think they will provide more evidence-based information. So what we have said so far has a tremendous positive impact on school cultures, leadership, and learners. And I think most of this can be more strengthened through character development. And you already have one. How do you connect all these qualities of emotional intelligence to character development?
I think that's a fantastic question. The emotional literacy side is just one element of emotional intelligence. Basically, we should look at it like this. We call it the O.R.B.I.T.S factor. So I wrote a series of books called Addy the Alien, and in there they talk about this O.R.B.I.T.S factor, URMM. So the U would stand for understanding your emotions, a fundamental process of understanding how you are feeling at the moment. Then it's about recognizing the emotions of others. That's the R part. And that's understanding that when you look scan a room, you can see how that room is. When you speak to a person, understand how they're feeling. Then it's about the management of those feelings, both yours and theirs. And then finally, we make smart choices. So the map was taken into a number of different schools. So it started. There's a few hundred schools that are in the UK that have the map. There's over 1,000 in South Africa and New Zealand and Australia. There's around about 150 to 200 that's in those regions. And what they've shown is that we need to highlight and enhance emotional literacy just to become better decision makers. There was some research done by Goldman, and he set up a thing called the Castle Report, which was originally set up at Yale University before it moved to Indianapolis. They were looking at 270,000 students, and when they looked at those students, when they had an emotional intelligence program embedded into the curriculum, they were able to enhance the performance of grade scores, the learning outcomes, by 11%. The poor behaviors, were reduced by 10%. So we recognize that there's empirical evidence all over the world that enhancing emotional intelligence actually helps us properly prepare our children for life after school.
Well, that's amazing, and I think this can be also used in literature classes.
Do you know what's very interesting you say that? There's a Dr. Elizabeth Shah is an American lady who connected with me, and she's been implementing the ESL program. So she's using English as a second language, and what she's done is she said, or what she found in her research was that the greater the connectivity between the teacher and the student, the higher the learning outcomes. And she says this, that the most important thing is to get them to talk. If you're teaching ESL, we want them to talk. And the thing is, it's so difficult finding what's the most common thing that we all like to talk about, what subject. And she came up with that it was themselves. Everybody likes to talk about themselves. And to do this in a way was about enhancing their feelings. And the map had a way that even if you didn't understand any of the language on the map, you would know that, if you came to the word optimism, and then you went to love, you would know that warm-hearted and happy, the words in between, were a more intense version of optimism, but but a less intense version of happiness. So it was a quite linear factor, so we could measure the intensity. And she said that they learned the words so well, but also they were able to eloquently qualify how they were feeling, and they were more open to do this. She feels that it had a massive impact, not just on the classroom, but she said it's been the best classrooms that she's had.
Wow, this is very interesting. And I think it helps also teach children not to make quick judgments on people.
Yes, absolutely. It's so important not for children to be judgmental, and if they recognize their emotions at any given moment, or if they're looking for emotions in others, they start to enhance this empathy. They start to understand how they can increase their empathy. So it was a lovely. I was flown out to Dubai, and I went to see an international school over there. And when I got there, the map was there, and they were telling me about a particular part of the English curriculum where they use a cross-curricular activity to enhance emotional intelligence. So it was simply an English lesson, and they were reading Roald Dahl's The Fantastic Mr. Fox. And what they were able to do is, if you know anything about the book, the fox is the good guy and the farmer is the bad guy. But what they were able to do is, like, they wanted to actively engage empathy, so to increase empathy of others. So in these exercises, in this English lesson, they were using the map and increasing empathy for the farmer. And the farmer was the disgruntled one. He was the one that was having his foxes stolen. And they were able to, at the end of this exercise, were able to empathize so empathetically and connectedly with the farmer that they changed their resolve. They were saying that the farmer was in fact the good guy and was the victim in this story, and the fox, even though he was described as such a lovable rogue by Roald Dahl, was now the villain.
That's a fascinating example, actually, and it helps also in self-regulation and self-management of emotions. That's really amazing, Carl. I am very happy that we had this conversation today. You say, and I quote, "Every decision we make, even the most logical of ones, is based on our emotions. It only makes sense that we should be developing our emotional literacy," unquote. And I fully agree with you here. Understanding emotions and the underlying energy beyond that is part of my O.R.B.I.T.S approach as well. I wish you all the best in your current and future work as you foster emotional intelligence.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
So coming to the end of another episode, I always end with an open-ended question for all of us to ponder. And this time, I will leave this question to my guest, Director of Psychology and Education, Carl Garner. Carl?
I would like you to consider the academics that are being pushed upon our children. Do you believe that we are properly preparing our children for life after school? And let me explain what I mean by that. When I was a young man, my father said to me, if you get your O-levels and you work hard, get good grades in your O-levels, you can go to college. And he was correct. And then a couple of years later, he said, son, if you work hard at your A-levels, you can then have a pick of whatever university you want to go to. And he was right. And then he said to me, at university, work hard, get your degree, and then you will be able to get a great job. And he was correct. The problem with this is I can no longer say that same story to my children, because now, even with degrees, there are people out here with master's degrees, even with PhDs, that are unable to find gainful employment because they don't have the soft core skills that companies are looking for.